Great, thanks very much, Kash Mitra. Thank you for leading us through in that meditation. So yeah, the little tech issue that we had just at the start is fixed now. So we did have the comments disabled off, the chat disabled off. It's now re-enabled. So particularly when that comes to you asking questions later in the class, that will be very useful for us. So you can now do that. So yes, I'm going to continue with this theme from the Vimalakirti Nirdesa from the last few weeks. We've been talking about this particular sutra, this Mahayana Sutra, for the last few weeks. And some of you that have tuned in so far will recognize it as being a land of magic and myth and colour and yeah, well, just a really sort of kind of amazing place. So in this particular chapter of the book, we've got to the point where Vimalakirti is now sat, and he's sat in his house, and his house has disappeared. Yeah, he's now become vast open space, and all the Bodhisattvas are now with Vimalakirti. They've all been transported from the various world systems all around to converse with Vimalakirti. And Vimalakirti has a question for them all. Yes, he's got a question for them all. He says, how do the Bodhisattvas enter the Dharma door of non-duality? How do the Bodhisattvas enter the Dharma door of non-duality? Now you might be remember from earlier in the Nirdesa that people are nervous, particularly the Arahants are nervous to go and see Vimalakirti. They don't like these sort of duels with him. He comes out on top all of the time, and they're nervous about him. But the Bodhisattvas have no such fear. They go and they're looking to learn. So they're quite happy to engage Vimalakirti. But he asks them this question. So just to say a Dharma door into the gateway of reality first, I would just explain that question. So what Vimalakirti is asking there is he wants the Bodhisattvas to explain to him how does non-duality exist as a gateway into reality. Yeah? So how is it we can use non-duality as a gateway into truth with a capital T or reality with a capital R? So we have various sort of gateways or doorways within the Dharma into reality. Yeah? So the Buddha was said to have discovered the path into reality, into the truth, into enlightenment. But he didn't discover just one path, he discovered a number of ways or a number of paths into it. Yeah. So sometimes that path is, say, the path of impermanence. We can look and observe at impermanence and follow that all the way into reality. Excuse me. We could look at, say, something like unsatisfactoriness, and we could, the more attention we pay into that, we could follow that all the way into reality. We could look at something like beauty. Yeah, we could notice beauty in the world, and beauty can be a gateway into reality, a gateway into truth. So there's various ways into the Buddha's enlightened vision. And of course, non-duality, Vimalakirti is saying that non-duality is one of them. I'll explain this term duality in a second. And so the Bodhisattvas give their various replies to this question, and then, as has been the case for the last few chapters, Manjushri, who's the Bodhisattva of wisdom, Vimalakirti asks Manjushri, and Manjushri gives his answer, and then Manjushri gives the question back to Vimalakirti. He asks Vimalakirti, well, Vimalakirti, you say, what is the Bodhisattvas? How do they enter into the Dharma door of non-duality? And in this particular famous instance, Vimalakirti is completely quiet. Yeah, so Manjushri asks him the question, Vimalakirti stays totally quiet. And this is said to be Vimalakirti's thunder-like silence. Yeah, thunder-like silence. So the silence that speaks a million words, the silence that conveys huge amounts of meaning, huge amounts of truth to it without ever saying anything at all. So he gives his thunder-like silence. And Well, what can we understand from this? Vimalakirti, I think what he's trying to say, because he's particularly talking about this concept of non-duality, he's particularly pointing out something about the reality or the nature of words and concepts. He's particularly pointing out that if he is going to give a sufficient answer to the Dharma door into non-duality, it can't use duality as part of the process. So most of the time we use words and concepts. We convey the Dharma through words and concepts. But of course, words and concepts are always dual. Now, what do I mean by that? When we use words and concepts, for example, we talk about things like truth or falsity, or light and darkness, or skillful and unskillful, love and hate. Yeah, so you describe these as dualities, they're poles. They sort of exist separately from each other. They're said to be separate things, so that's what we mean by a duality. And Vimalakirti wants to transcend all dualities, so he's given the thunder-like silence in response. Now, of course, you wouldn't be particularly impressed with me if I was to just do that this evening, if I was to just sit here and give the Amalayodhin thunder-like silence. I'm afraid it wouldn't be quite as impressive. It wouldn't come from the same place as Vimalakirti. So we have to communicate the Dharma through words and concepts, don't we? There's no other alternative. But that's okay, we can do that as well. We can use duality to transcend, or we can use dualistic words and concepts to transcend duality. We can use duality to transcend duality. That is also possible. You'll have to take that on faith. I do as well. But we can use duality to transcend duality. So that was the Buddha used words and messages, for example, words and concepts. So we can we can transcend dualistic thinking with words and concepts using dualistic terms. The problem is that, as Vimalakirti is looking to point out, is that reality, or the Buddha's enlightened vision, is non-dualistic. So he is pointing out something about the weakness of words and concepts and trying to point to something that's non-dualistic. That's something that has transcended words and concepts, something that is beyond words and concepts. He's pointing to the difficulty in the nature of doing that. So what Vimalakirti's pointing to is the danger of using words and concepts in this way, and I think we have to keep in mind the danger of using words and concepts in this way. So what we can forget with concepts, with words, with language, is that what words do, what concepts do, and of course concepts are just a collection of words, is they take something and they abstract it. So a word is an abstraction, or a concept is an abstraction. What it does is it takes it out of something's context and it sort of names it. So that's what we look to do when we conceptualize, or we put a label on something or a word on something. We take it out of its general surroundings, the context in which it's in, and then we put it separately so we can look at it, what we think clearly. We sort of shear it of all its sort of the context in which it lives in, and then we look at it clearly. So there is, of course, a use to doing that as well, isn't it? But we've taken it out of its context. Of course, the problem is that reality won't be abstracted. Meaning won't be abstracted in that kind of way. It's not like that we can do the same thing with reality. We can't, because reality is contextualized, because it's interdependent, because it's interconnected. We can't do the same with reality. We can't take it out of its context because it is contextualized and sort of give a label on it. So what we need to remember when we're using words and concepts, I think, is that actually what we're looking to do is use them to point at something that's beyond them. we're looking to use them to get beyond them somehow, to sort of suggest something that's beyond them. So what we're trying to do, I think, is get at something of the meaning behind those words and concepts. Difficult because they're abstracted, they're made explicit, they're shorn of their context, but we can look to do that. So I think part of the problem with this is that meaning, for human meaning, is nearly always implied. The vast majority of truth that we communicate, or of meaning that we communicate, is nearly always implied. It's implicit. Say, for example, metaphor. Now, the Buddha used metaphor quite a lot in his teaching. So if you go through the Pali Canon is the record of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha regularly uses metaphor as a way of trying to convey the vision of what he saw, the vision of his enlightenment. He uses metaphor as a way of doing it. So sometimes you'll get these lists in the Pali Canon that just sort of list all the ways, all the metaphors that the Buddha gave for the various teachings that he was giving. So he'll say the metaphor of the banyan tree, or the metaphor of the monkey passing from tree to tree, or the metaphor of the bark. He'll give all of these metaphors, lists of metaphors. And he really was a bit of an expert, actually, at using metaphor as a way of pointing out something about his vision, about his experience reality, about his enlightened reality. And of course, metaphor has an implied meaning, doesn't it? It doesn't have an explicit meaning. It's suggestive. What we do with metaphor is we suggest something. We liken something to something else. So we keep something sort of in context, don't we, when we use metaphor? It's nuanced. It's pointing to something. It's not a concept in the same way, like it's not dualistic in the same way that words are outside of a metaphorical context. So I think metaphor, implied meaning, is the majority way that we can actually look to communicate something of reality, something of meaning. And when I say meaning, I mean something close to reality. Yeah? When we say we experience meaning, I think really what we're saying is actually we're experiencing something that's real. We've come something closer to something that feels real to us, with the capital R. Feels weighty to us, feels important to us. Yeah. So when we're conveying meaning, I think we're conveying reality in a certain way. So we do that with metaphor. We do it in other various ways as well. I mean, it's really interesting that I'm reading this book by Ian McGilchrist at the moment, the Master and His Emissary. I'm constantly talking about it. So if you've heard me talk about it already, do forgive me. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But he was interviewed by Maitrevandu and Jnanavacha some time ago. And he, in his book, talks about how, well, he's got this theory. He's both a neurobiologist and a psychiatrist and a professor of literature. And his particular theory is that we've become very, very left-brained. So we've got these two hemispheres. One which is the left brain, which orientates itself very much to abstractions, to concepts, to words, to labels. And this right brain, which is very much orientated to poetry, to implicit meaning as opposed to explicit meaning, to symbol, to metaphor. And his particular theory is that we've become very, very weighted towards the left brain, and therefore to abstraction, to conceptualization. And he feels like that we confuse these abstractions and these conceptualizations for reality, for the truth. And in the book, he talks about how actually a bit like I've been talking about, how reality, meaning, is often much more right-brained than that. Is often much more poetic, much more symbolic, much more of the implied. It's interesting, apparently, he goes through this in the book, apparently human beings communicated initially through a variety of song. Yeah, so that's actually language has its origins within song. Apparently there's still some tribes that communicate in this way as well, almost predominantly through song. So it's toned, it's people are listening for the tone, for the cadence, for the rhythm, and that's actually conveying the particular meaning that they're looking to get at. Apparently also it's the first sort of stage that develops within us when we're babies, is this communication through song. So say for example, newborn parents, when they talk to the baby, they're talking this sort of and it's all song, isn't it? It would be very unusual to talk to a baby in any other way, wouldn't it? You sort of meet a new baby and go, hello baby, how was your day today? You know, did you enjoy school? It would be very unusual to speak to a baby like that. The baby would be like, what is this person talking about? What the baby responds to is music. So you communicate to the baby through music. You put in speech, but it's all cadenced and toned and rhythmed in the way that you're looking to communicate with it. And then it responds accordingly, which then encourages it from the parents, apparently. Shouldn't be encouraged beyond the years of 2, I would say. Starts to get a bit overkill at that point. But that's what we do. Apparently then what happened was that music became poetry. Yeah, so then we started communicating through poetry. This is the theory of how language developed. So again, you're starting to have a slightly more solidified or reified use of words or of concepts, but used in such a way that's designed to communicate meaning in a way that's implied, or in a way that gives you a shade or a tone of what you're talking about. Of course, poetry does this, doesn't it? If we ever read poetry, you can be sat there and all of a sudden you can read something and just be shot into a different world. You're just completely shot into a different reality. Music can do this as well, of course, can't it? And the reality that it shot you into could not be talked about simply in terms of concepts. It's an implied, an implicit, a lived reality. It's beyond dualism. Yeah, it won't deal in words in that particular way. It won't deal in abstractions in that particular way. Only really poetry can do this to us. It's very, very hard for words or concepts to do it. So I think that's something, you know, I think hopefully in that I'm pointing to something of how words and concepts can fail us to adequately communicate something of meaning, something of reality, something of truth. What we need is something implied. What we need is something symbolic, like music or like poetry. Philosophy apparently caught on to this in the sort of the early part of the 20th century as well. So some of you, I'm not particularly familiar with either of these writers, but some of you might be familiar, say for example, with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer believed that reality was best conveyed through music, and the person that he felt that did this best was Wagner. Wagner is a writer of operas. I'm afraid I do not get on with it. It's the one sort of art medium that I just cannot grasp. It almost sounds comic to me, you know, when people sort of sing, "Could you pass me the salt, dear?" It just doesn't. Anyway, upstairs, Maitreya Bandhu, and I live upstairs in Samagavaswa with Maitreya Bandhu and Yanavacha and Parama Bandhu, and they're big into opera and they're big into Wagner. And I'm afraid I cannot seem to sort of crack the opera conundrum, despite trying. So I have actually sat down through 3 hours of Wagner with them and been left totally cold at the end of it. So I'm still working on that one, I think. But Schopenhauer felt that the music of Wagner, the opera of Wagner, best communicated something of reality for him. Heidegger, for example, thought it was poetry. So I really think there's something to that idea. So communicating something that's beyond words and concepts is very, very difficult to do through words and concepts. Yeah, very, very difficult to do through words and concepts. And I think what we have to do is bear in mind when we're communicating through words and concepts that the medium is imperfect. Yeah, so we always have to take the words with a sense of nuance. Everything has to be taken with a slight grain of salt. What will be true in one instance, what can be said of to somebody in one instance and be true, be meaningful, might not necessarily be able to be true and meaningful for another person. This is one of the things that's the problem, say, for example, with communicating the Dharma to a group of people or to a class of people. One of the things that Bhante said, I thought very interesting, one of his aphorisms was that Bhante Sangharakshita, the man who founded the Triratna movement, one of the things that he said was that the Dharma could only be communicated one-to-one. Now that's not to say that nothing of the truth or reality can't be communicated in a group. But the problem with communicating to a group of people is that you don't quite take into account the individual circumstance in what you're communicating. Often it would seem to me is that meaning or truth is more. It's more a sense of emphasis, particularly when we're talking through words and concepts. So what struck me, for example, is that often you can say a truth, repeat a truth until it becomes false. Yeah, you can repeat something until it's actually become untrue. Say, for example, something like if you were, let's take a random example, you could say it's good to think for yourself. Now, it's broadly true to say it's good to think for yourself, isn't it? However, we could repeat that, or we could emphasize it until it becomes false. Because it's also true to say that you also need to take into account the opinions of those around you, of the opinions of your friends, for example. You need to take into account the opinions of the wise. So when we're communicating in something as sort of dualistic as words and concepts, and saying something as black as white and as black or white as it's good to think for oneself, you then have to caveat that with the idea that will be true to a certain extent and for certain people. You need to bring something of the nuance back into that, something of the non-duality back into that. That statement can be both true and false. Yeah, and that's where I think you probably start to get a sense of truth with a capital T, transcending a dualism. You've got this dualism of true and false, but actually truth or transcendence or enlightened truth, to put it that way, transcends that dichotomy between true and false. It's more colourful than that, it's more nuanced than that. And words, of course, often just abstract themselves from all of that. So we have to keep that in mind. So it's very, very important not to cling to words and concepts. Really, really important not to cling to words and concepts, because there might be a time that we have to ditch a particular concept, a particular truth that we've held to very strongly and which might have done its work for us up to that time. We might have to ditch that as a truth. It strikes me actually that the further and further you get along the path, the poorer words and concepts do at sort of clarifying things for the next sort of step, because it becomes more and more subtle each time. And of course, words aren't subtle. They don't tend to be subtle. Poetry can be subtle, music can be subtle, but words tend to be black and white. So as soon as we start to get beyond those initial stages of our Dharma life, everything becomes more subtle and refined, and words and concepts do less and less justice to the Buddha's vision as we start to move along. At the start, I think it's okay, but as it goes, it gets more difficult. So we really have to be careful not to cling too much to those words or concepts, because eventually we might have to let them go. The metaphor, the simile that the Buddha gave for this was one of the raft. Yeah, if you have a raft and you want it to go to another shore with it, to a further shore, or you want to bring it to a certain place, once the raft has served its purpose, you don't stay clinging to it. You don't bring it around with you. You let it. You leave it where it is, and you keep on going. So really important that we don't cling. I think part of the problem with words and concepts, and this whole issue that McGilchrist is pointing out with us becoming more and more literal minded through the left brain, is that they tend to cling, they tend to be clingy, they tend to be sort of sticky. If we're becoming more and more literal minded, we lose touch from nuance, don't we? Very, very hard to get polarized or cling very strongly to something that's nuanced. Poetry never caused a war, did it? A piece of music never caused a war. You could have friends that differ on their music tastes. But as soon as they do that, they've probably started to abstract it into concepts again. They've started to get into a disagreement based around concepts. So nuance, poetry, symbol, music, meaning communicated in that way, truth communicated that way, tends much less to polarization than words and concepts. You could think of dualism as in fact as polarization. You've got these two poles of true and false. So because words are dualistic, I think in this way they tend to literalism, as McGilchrist is pointing out in his book, and they tend to polarity as well. They tend to divide, to create disagreement. And of course we're seeing that, aren't we? We live in a more and more polarized world now. Politically, we're living in an extremely polarized world. And possibly that's because we've lost sight of nuance. We've lost sight of metaphor. We've come to construct a world around us based on concepts and words that we take as really true. And when that world is challenged by a different set of concepts or words, it's very threatening, it's very undermining, and that's when we react with hostility. So yes, I think it's very, very important to make sure that the words and the concepts that we use, we take as provisional, and we're happy to let them go and drop them when needs be as well. So I think that's all I've got to say on this particular topic. I won't. I've finished slightly early, but I won't roll it out anymore. Otherwise, I'll possibly just be repeating myself. But yeah, maybe on the basis of that, you can start to think of questions around that. But also, I'd say, if I was to make a call from this particular talk, it's let's see, where can we start? First of all, start to drop clinging to our opinions, because our opinions are so rooted in words and concepts. Maybe we could start to think of our opinions more in the sense of poetry, of words and concepts, of facts, quote unquote more as poetry, as more poetically. So can we start to engage more poetically with the world? Can we start to engage with meaning in that sort of poetic sense, or that music sense? Engaging with the arts actually in that way is really, really important. Engaging with poetry, engaging with symbol, engaging with music. Say, for example, I mean, how much sometimes I've known people that have started out on their whole path to Buddhism through just seeing the symbol of the Buddha. That symbol itself carrying so much meaning, so much truth for people. How can we start to engage with our world in a way like that, that sees meaning, it sees the meaning beyond words, beyond opinions, sees it sort of poetically. So that's a sort of my request for us this week is, can we engage? Well, we can literally engage with art, we can literally engage with poetry, but can we start to see the world much more as a metaphor rather than a data set, shall we say? So we'll leave it at that for this week. Now you will have a chance to, we'll leave it at that, I'll leave it at that for this bit this week. Now you will have a chance to ask questions. So we're going to have a break for about, we'll say about 6 minutes now. We'll come back at 8 o'clock and pop your questions into the chat box, and Sam will look to get them to us. So Cash Mitchell's going to join again for that. Great. See you all soon.
Great. Yeah, so welcome back, everyone. I just want to say thank you to you, first of all, Amalayodhin, for really engaging talk. I think talking about the non-duality of duality and so on is like not an easy thing to take on. I read the chapter this afternoon that this comes from, and it's very it's quite a dense, quite a sticky subject. So I think you've steered us a really clear course through that, and I found what you were saying very engaging. We just had a bit of a chat at the break, and I think it's very, very interesting, this whole area. So I'm looking forward to maybe having a bit more discussion around the questions. So we do have time for some questions now. If people want to put their questions in the chat. Are there any already in, Sam?
There's a couple, yes. So you have one from Oliver, which is how to know if I'm using the left side of my brain too much and the right side not enough.
Okay, so Oliver's asking how to know if I'm using the left-hand side of my brain too much and the right not enough. So do you want to, you're the one that's reading the book. Yeah. So nice to hear from you, Oliver. Yeah.
I'd say first of all, Oliver, probably a good, just to mention the sort of left or right brain sort of theory wouldn't be the way we'd usually describe it from a Dharmic context. It's perfectly fine. It's very nice when sort of science kind of seems to kind of confirm what it is you already believe, but and I think McGilchrist even in the book would look to warn against this idea of consciousness or the mind coming from the brain. He does have this whole book, of course, about sides of the brain and how they create ideas and cultures and ways of looking at the world. But he actually doesn't believe that consciousness comes from the brain. So it's a little bit more complicated than using the left side of our brain and the right side of our brain. But let's sort of, so if we were to put it in a more kind of Dharmic way, we'd probably say something like, the logical aspect of ourselves and the poetic aspect of ourselves, the creative aspect of ourselves. I think most of us probably use the logical aspect of our minds probably a lot more than the more creative side now. Most of our jobs require conceptual thinking in words, usually on a screen, disembodied from the body, from nature around us, from physical activity. It tends to be, we live in an economy that's by and large conceptual and word based. I do. I work in a Buddhist center. I still deal with words and concepts all day. So I think we can probably take it to a certain extent for granted that we will need to work on our creative side of our mind a bit more. You think about that, Kashmir?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, and I think probably one of the ways that you could tell that you're really not creating, enough of the opposite is just feeling a bit overloaded, a bit run down, a bit kind of lacking in inspiration, really. And I think one of the ways to get around that is to start off by just creating more space, really. Because if we're trying to think in that way too much of the time, we're not leaving ourselves time for space and time to digest, really. So I think just creating more space, reducing input, and even sort of creating, I mean, at the moment you need to largely do this at home, but creating retreat conditions. Myself and Amalayodhin before were talking about going on solitary retreats, and that's when I think I feel most in touch with that state where I'm able to respond more to symbol and concept. And I mean, those of you that were here last week, I was talking about being on a solitary retreat and seeing these kind of birds flying across, after a meditation, and somehow it felt deeply symbolic and deeply meaningful. And we can start to respond to the world more in that way if we're in more of a receptive state. But I think we definitely need to create space in order to do that. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Oliver. Yeah, great. And let's see if there's any more questions.
There's one more from Adam. Adam asks, I'm a musician and I'm trying to see my music pursuits in terms of doing it because it makes me happy and because of service to others rather than status and money. Any advice for this? Thanks.
You're looking at me.
Yeah. Kashmir is a musician, or at least partly.
Yeah, so I did used to work, I did used to be a composer. I used to do it fairly seriously for a long time. And well, first of all, I just want to say, I'll just repeat the question. So, who was it from?
Adam.
It's from Adam. Yeah. So Adam was saying that he wants to, that he's a musician, and he wants to see his music practice in terms of enjoyment because it makes him happy, and also being of service to others. And any advice on that? So my advice on that would be. Well, it's two things. I guess what you're trying to do there is you're trying to move away from something and you're trying to move towards something, aren't you? You're trying to move away from a certain way of being and a certain motivation, and you're trying to move towards a certain way of being and a certain motivation. And I think you can do both of those directly and indirectly. So I think the fact that you're already saying that you want to move away from doing that for money or for status or for other things. I think the fact that you've already noticed that means that you're sort of halfway there with that already, really. But what I would say is that you can work on that indirectly, and this was definitely my experience. So when I started getting seriously into composition, and when I went back to university in my 30s and studied composition at university, did a master's and so on, and started doing lots of very enjoyable work around that time. I was working with a lot of contemporary dance companies, and that coincided with me. I'd been involved with the Dharma and with Triratna when I was younger, and it coincided with me coming back to Triratna when I was in my 30s. And definitely that had a strong effect. And I think all you need to do really is relax and trust in your practice and trust in your motivation, and actually that will then come out in your music. You can't but any creative thing that we do, whether it's painting or whether it's music or whether it's poetry or whatever it is, we can't but fail to, that's going to be a reflection of who we are and where we're at in our lives, isn't it? So I just think you need to relax on the one hand and sort of trust in your practice and trust in the process of making music. But again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, if you pardon the pun. But you also need to create space. and you need to be receptive. And also, I think it's very, very good to expose yourself to the right influences as well. So, you know, if you do create space and you are receptive, and you've already got that motivation to make music or whatever it is, then discover people who inspire you. You know, so I was very, very inspired by the work of John Cage. And not particularly as a composer, actually, but just generally in his approach to life, and the way he was as an artist, and kind of how he approached his work, you know, and other composers I could mention as well, but I won't make this too much about me. But yeah, I think just, you know, create space. And through that, you'll create receptivity, and then also kind of seek out inspiration, I think. Yeah. What would you say?
Yeah, well, I really like this, you know, this point particularly of creating space, and well, of course, it's inherent in your name, isn't it? Akasha Mitra, meaning friend of space. And there's something I think about that whole aspect of creating space that opens you up to meaning, because it really does seem to me that meaning is something that's received, isn't it? It feels like that more and more strongly. Actually, it's something that you open up to, that you receive, which is often not the metaphor that we think of in the way of ascertaining truth. We think of ascertaining it, don't we? We think of grasping it.
That's right.
What's often said is you grasp the truth. Of course, you can grasp a truth on a sort of conceptual level, can't you? But you can't in this more implied, in this more lived sense, in an experiential sense, or in a creative sense like that. You have to, as you say, open up a space for it and receive, which is a different muscle from the one that we usually use. So yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, and particularly in this whole area of metaphor and myth and creativity, it's not something that will behave itself like the way we go about getting other things, worldly things, for example. Right. So.
I mean, I think it does come back to this. I mean, I haven't read Ian McGilchrist's book, so. But I did see the interviews with him, which I found very, very engaging. I think it seems to come back to this left brain, right brain thing, doesn't it? Is that we live in a culture which is very much emphasizes, you know, there's a concept, you hear about it or you read about it and you get it, and that's it, you know. And what we're talking about is something much, much more nuanced than that. I mean, it put me in mind of, there's well, he's a very interesting guy. Kind of started off as a pop musician in the 60s, but there's a composer that I really like who just died a couple of years ago called Scott Walker. And this guy, like, he had big chart success in the 60s with a band called the Walker Brothers that, you know, did tunes that you'll probably all know. And then he just went on a wider and wider and wider orbit and started making this really far out music in the kind of 90s and noughties and, you know, until quite recently. Very, very, very interesting. But it would take him years and years and years to make new material, and he would very rarely give interviews. And I remember seeing this interview with him once where they were saying, you know, well, what's your process? You know, what do you do? And he said, well, I don't like to talk about it because, you know, I don't want to put a jinx on it. But basically, it seemed that what he did was he would just take himself off somewhere and live in solitude and silence until very much the thing that you were talking about, Amalayodhin. I mean, it's, you know, it's almost like you get into classical language around the muse descending or something like that. You know, it's like he would wait for something to happen, and then that would be it. And he would see himself as a channel for something. And I think that gets much more closely into the territory of what we're talking about, isn't it? Rather than just understanding something on a conceptual level.
That's right.
I mean, as you were talking earlier, it really, you know, what came to my mind is that in a sense, this whole text, the Vimalakirti Nirdesa, is an attempt to communicate in that way, isn't it? You know, you could say something to somebody like, don't get sidetracked in your Dharma life. But that just has such limited weight, doesn't it? Whereas if you paint this incredible picture and you have this whole drama around it and you have these different characters, somehow it's like we have to engage our imagination. And in the opening up of our imagination, it's there's just a much more nuanced, finer point, A, that we can grasp, and B, somehow it gets, we don't just understand it on a conceptual level, it kind of gets into our bones, it really gets into our being.
That's right. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Any more questions, Sam?
Not yet, although I'm sure there.
Okay.
That's right.
Lots of gratitude. Adam says he's also a composer. Maybe he's a fan of Scott Walker.
Great.
Yeah, well, if one comes to you folks, do let us know. But yeah, this whole area, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that I'd remembered, Bhante talks a bit about it, doesn't he? How Darwin apparently really used to enjoy the poetry of Shakespeare,
right?
And always fantasized during his working life about retiring, enjoying and starting to enjoy again the poetry of Shakespeare, and of course worked in this world of science and concepts for a whole of his career, and then found that he couldn't actually appreciate it anymore. He got back to it. He retired from his scientific life and apparently couldn't appreciate the poetry of Shakespeare anymore, the works of Shakespeare anymore. Which really, it's not quite tragic, is it? Because he gave, obviously, the world this fantastic theory which explains a lot and has done a lot of benefit as well, no doubt. But that faculty just withered up.
No, that's it. It's interesting, isn't it? And it is a faculty. It's not just a given.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's true if we look at that in Dharmic terms as well, isn't it? It's like when we first come along to the Buddhist Center and we try to meditate or something. I mean, maybe that's not 100% useful metaphor, because some people seem to take to it straight away, don't they? But it's like so many things. It's not that's not something that we can necessarily just step into. It's a faculty that we need to train in ourselves, which I know you're still working on in relation to Wagner. But I did laugh before, actually, when you started talking about that, because I'm not a particularly big Wagner fan either. So I did sort of slightly cheer when you said But that's the thing, isn't it? I think that the point of what we're saying is that is a faculty that needs to be trained, and we need to create conditions for it as well. We need to create conditions where there's space and there's receptivity and so on.
No, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, just being open to the possibility that we being curious about life, that we don't know. I mean, I think this is the other aspect of it as well. It's like, if you go right back to the start of the Vimalakirti Nirdesa, you'll remember that what happens at the start is the arahants are all gathered, and Vimalakirti tells them he's going to teach them something new, and the arahants don't like it. The arahants in these guys, in this particular sense, are the Hinayana enlightened monks. So they slightly take on the role of the fall guy. They're given a sort of slightly different role in this movement of the Mahayana than they would have previously had. So to be taken with a pinch of salt, but the arahants don't know, walk out on the basis that they feel like that they've got nothing more to know. And I think again, this sort of creative relating to life is a relating to the world around us on the basis of not knowing more and more. It's a curiousness about, and of course, knowledge in that sort of sense of certainty crowds out curiosity, doesn't it? Crowds out imagination. So if we go around knowing a lot and being certain and being sure, we're shutting down the very faculty that can actually open up to meaning and truth.
I think it's like it's a bit going back to what you were saying before. It's like A not knowing, or B, I mean, we were talking about this in the break, weren't we? I was just echoing what you were saying about, that the more one goes on with one's practice, it's very, very hard to articulate something. So it's like A, not knowing, or B, knowing that what's worth knowing can't always be articulated as well. It's very, very difficult to do that. You know, you can use words and concepts that get some way close to articulating what your experience is, but actually it doesn't really point to the kind of heartwood of that, you know, something that's the most valuable thing about it, or the real depth of experience.
There's this great quote from Oscar Wilde, I think it's Oscar Wilde, where he says that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly.
Right, okay.
I really like that. They take themselves lightly, but also they take their opinions lightly. They take their what they know lightly, and it's on that basis that they can take flight. Which I've always really, really liked that idea. But of course, that's not the particular faculty that we privilege, because it's not useful in the same way, is it? You know, we privilege certainty, we privilege knowledge in that particular sort of conceptual way. And which is to say, there's nothing particularly wrong with all of that side of it.
It's got its place, doesn't it? It definitely has its place. We'd be stuffed without it, in fact. But it's recognising what its place is, and not thinking that that's the be all and end all. You know, I mean, it's a bit like. It makes me think a bit of like when we have silence on retreats. You know, for those of you that have been on retreat, you know, you'll know that when we run retreats, we often have periods of silence, and we have some retreats where there are very long periods of silence. And you know, I love conversation, and I love talking with people. You know, it's a wonderful thing, and there's a place for that. And but I think in our culture, there's not enough space for space, and there's not enough space for silence. You know. And there are things that can only really arise in silence and in space, we don't make space for enough of the time. I
think that's right. And of course, so much gets communicated in silence as well. So much of each other, doesn't it? That's right. So much of each other. You get to know. I found I get to know somebody very well within silence on a retreat, as much as I would, maybe even more than I would through speaking. Anything else there?
Yes, you've got an interesting one from Emma, where she says, is seeing things through duality a bad thing? Or is duality there because without it we can't find our way to non-duality? And I think...
Well, maybe I'll repeat the question and just say... So Emma is asking... sorry, what was it again? Saying,
is duality useful to a point?
Is duality useful to a point? Well, I think it's inevitable that we have to be dualistic.
It's just what we're in.
It's just what we're in. Our world, samsara, our unenlightened world, is dualistic. There's no way of getting around it. So we'll have to use duality as best as we possibly can to somehow transcend duality. So something of the nature of it has to sort of change. We have to make a quantum leap at some point using duality over into this world of non-duality. Impossible to say what happens there. I certainly don't know. It's a complete mystery to me. I don't know what might happen with that. But as far as the Buddha was concerned, we can do it. We can use dualistic concepts, but we can use them in a way that starts to approach something closer to that non-dualism. So we can use them poetically, we can use them metaphorically. We can resist the tendency towards literalism or explicitness. It's interesting, isn't it, how much sort of explicitness can spoil something. It's a bit like a joke. As soon as you explain the joke, it's destroyed. It's completely. So human beings really valued the implied, and so we can really look to use that and develop that, I think, as well.
I think it's interesting that you use the word transcend as well, because I think it's also important to say that the Buddha hadn't completely, was I mean, this is difficult to talk about, and I'm obviously not talking from experience, but the Buddha had transcended duality, but could still dip back into it when he needed to. That's the thing, could still get up in the morning and talk to someone and get dressed and so on. And it's not like the Buddha was just sort of floating in space. So it's what we're doing is sort of moving towards something that goes beyond those dualistic concepts. But the Buddha's transcended that in the sense of it's still available to him, but also he's left that behind. And also I think it's important to say why one would want to do that. Is that ultimately that kind of thinking is the cause of our suffering. It's not just a sort of a spiritual stroke intellectual exercise, for its own sake. Yeah.
That's right. So
okay. Yeah.
Good.
So, are there any? Okay, let's try and.
From Oliver again. Do we need to have that wisdom in order to appreciate non-duality?
Do we have to
have developed wisdom in order to appreciate non-duality?
I think the short answer to that is yes, Oliver.
Yeah.
We need to develop wisdom to appreciate non-duality. I think it's beyond most of us, certainly me, much of the time. So.
And in a sense, that's what it is. Really, that's what from the Buddhist way of talking about wisdom. In a sense, that's what it is. Is seeing that's one way of talking about it. Is seeing through duality. So it's like wisdom develops as we do that more and more. Yeah. Great. Okay. So thanks very much for your questions, everyone. I really enjoy getting questions from people, and it's lovely to be able to sort of discuss this a bit more with you, Amalayodhin, as well. So I just want to say thanks once again to you for really, really wonderful teaching and really bringing that teaching alive. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're almost at the end of the evening, folks. But I just want to say a couple of things before the end of the evening. So one of the things that I want to say is just to talk a little bit about a couple of things that are coming up. We've got a couple of things that are starting very soon, which it's not too late to sign up for. So we've got the pop-up retreat, which is an online retreat, and that starts tomorrow, and that's from the 26th to the 29th. On that retreat, there'll be extra meditation classes, there'll be daily study with you, Amalayodhin, is that right?
I'll be continuing that as well.
Yeah. So there'll be study, there'll be evening workshops, there'll be talks on the arts and friendship, there'll be a talk from Yanavacha, and that retreat's going to culminate in Sangha Day Festival, which is on Sunday. So you still can sign up for that retreat. So I imagine that you do that by going onto the website. It's still possible to sign up for that, basically. And also just to say, as I said before, that's going to culminate in Sangha Day on Sunday, where we're celebrating one of the three jewels, which is Sangha, which is spiritual community. So we're celebrating the spiritual community, celebrating the fact that we have this wonderful gift of community and connection with other beings who are practicing on the path. And as part of that day, there will be Mitra ceremonies, where people will be making a declaration, publicly declaring that they feel themselves to be a Buddhist and that they want to practice within this community. So I'd say particularly tune in for that. I think that would be wonderful. And also, there's a 4-week course starting tomorrow, and so it's 4 Thursdays from tomorrow, and that's an introduction to Buddhism and meditation, and that's led by myself and Surya Gupta. So if you want to do a kind of introductory course for 4 weeks, where we'll be looking at who the Buddha was, what his relevance is for us today, what he can teach us about our lives, and we'll be teaching 2 meditation practices that we teach in this community. We'll be teaching that on that 4-week course as well. So that starts tomorrow, and it's not too late to sign up for that as well. So chances are, if you're tuning into this class, you have some familiarity with Buddhism, but you might want to go back and look at the basics again, which is always a good thing to do, or you might know of a friend who's interested in doing that as well. And then the other thing I want to say is just that we really need your support financially at the moment. So if you are able to, it'd be very, very good if you can give something for tuning into this class. So this centre runs on generosity, and it runs on people like myself and Sam and Amalayodhin giving our time. You know, we don't get paid to do this class. We do it because we want to make the Dharma available to people, but it costs money to run the centre, and it costs money to put things like this on and to put retreats on and so on. Yeah, do support us financially if you can, and by doing that, you know, it's one of the easiest ways, I think, particularly in the situation that we're in at the moment. You know, I've been teaching a few things recently where people say, well, you know, practically, how can I practice generosity when I'm not able to see people? You know, we're in lockdown and so on. And one of the easiest and most straightforward ways that you can do that is actually just by giving to the LBC, in the knowledge that whatever you give will be used to make the Dharma available to more people. Yeah, so if you're able to do that, you could give some money for the class this evening, say £10 or something like that. And also, if you're able to set up a monthly direct debit, that would be really, really helpful. Or also, you know, if you want to join the retreat, I think, is there a fixed fee for the retreat?
No, completely free.
But if you do the retreat, you know, you could donate generously. So I'm falling over my words slightly. You could donate generously for that as well. So great. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish the evening with the transference of merit and self-surrender. So any merit, any good karma that we've gained this evening, we're not interested in holding on to that for ourselves. We're going to give that out into the world for the benefit of all beings. So that's what we're doing when we say these verses. So we'll do this in call and response, and it'd be lovely if you can join in with this at home. Can you pass that? Great. Thank you. The transference of merit and self-surrender. May the merit gained.
May the merit gained.
In my acting thus.
In my acting thus.
Go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings.
Go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings.
My personality throughout my existences.
My personality throughout my existences.
My possessions.
My possessions.
And my merit in all three ways.
And my merit in all three ways.
I give up without regard to myself.
I give up without regard to myself.
For the benefit of all beings.
For the benefit of all beings.
Just as the earth and other elements.
Just as the earth and other elements.
Are serviceable in many ways.
Are serviceable in many ways.
To the infinite number of beings.
To the infinite number of beings.
Inhabiting limitless space.
Inhabiting limitless space.
So may I become.
So may I become.
That which maintains all beings.
That which maintains all beings.
Situated throughout space.
Situated throughout space.
So long as all have not attained.
So long as all have not attained.
To peace.
To peace.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Really lovely to have you with us this evening, and hope you all have a good week. And just thanks once again to Amalayodhin, and thank you very much to Sam for the tech. And look after yourselves and take care.
Great. See you soon, folks.